like Dr. Frankenstein himself, I've stitched two games together and brought one back from the dead. Hello friends, and welcome to Little Giant Crafts. So, yeah, I made a game. Before we talk about that, though, we need to rewind a little bit and talk about an earlier game called Horror Clicks. If there's one thing I love, it's monsters. Horror movie monsters, sci-fi, fantasy, any kind, I'm happy. So in 2006, a game came out called Horror Clicks. If you're familiar with HeroClix, which has, comic book characters, it's similar, made by the same people, and the gist of the game was that you took all these different classical monster archetypes and just threw them together and fought. And it was really cool. I was really into it. I collected a lot of the figures. They were pre-painted, so I hadn't really gotten into Warhammer or crafting or anything, so that really appealed to me that I didn't have to paint them. Now, one of the things the game did really well was how thematic it all was. There were victims on the board that each team of monsters would be trying to hunt. There were plot twist cards, which used a lot of different, movie tropes, like someone tripping and falling, or making a makeshift weapon, or being hypnotized, things that would take control of the victims, or, they could fight back, things like that. Each set had different themes as well. It was one of those games where it comes in a blind box and you get a few random ones you don't get to, pick, which is not my favorite, but whatever. But each release would have a themed set. So there was a sci-fi themed set, there was all circus characters, the last set was nightmares, and by that point they had already kind of started to lose the theming. Not lose it, but they just weren't sticking to it as tightly. But I really like that idea as someone who likes grouping things together in lists, which is probably the lamest thing I've ever said. But the idea of grouping these monsters into different theme sets really appealed to me. So, I started making lists of my own, like movie monsters that I would like to see in the game. They did have a few tie-ins, like Hellboy and Freddy vs. Jason, Alien vs. Predator, which also those two are just good examples of the game because it's literally, these different characters fighting. But I liked coming up with my own ideas. One I worked on for a long time was a set revolving around cryptids. Obviously, if you don't know, I make a podcast about cryptids, so that's always something I've really enjoyed. And that's where that sat for years and years, until coming back to some of my recent videos, I found OnePageRules, and specifically they have a few one-off games, and one of those is warstuff, which is basically just a simplified version of the rules with points for, powers and creating figures. And it occurred to me that this would be a perfect framework for taking all those monsters I have, because, I never got rid of them, and, bringing the game back in this new form. So like I said, I like making themed groups. So once I got this idea to sort of reinvent HorrorClix, I spent a long time working on that, just, thinking of monsters, going through, lists of movie monsters and mythology and all that. And a few months back, maybe springtime-ish, I realized it was pretty soon after I'd started this channel, or at least filming for this channel, and I thought, I want to do something special for October. Halloween's obviously my favorite holiday. I should get this game done by then. And let me tell you, Halloween seemed a lot further away in spring. But yeah, so I sort of gave myself a deadline, which is the only way I ever get anything done, and started working on this more in earnest. I went through the rules and sort of, cherry-picked the different rules and thematic things that I wanted to keep. And the two, well, I guess three aspects of the game that I liked the most, that I wanted to, translate into war stuff, is the monsters hunting victims, or rescuing them if you're playing a heroic character. The deck of cards, the plot twists that can affect gameplay just because they add a nice, cinematic flair. And They had these tokens that they just called them portals, but they were basically doors and you could open or close them. And, it was like a person running into the house, closing the door, and then the monster trying to get in. So I had those in mind, and then I looked at war stuff and those rules and what I needed to tweak there. The gameplay with victims translated pretty much one-to-one. The game as it is basically just, taking turns activating a unit. Really the only difference now is you move a victim and then you move a unit. Pretty easy. I did some playtesting with my partner, and we realized that it would be too easy to move victims right into monsters and get themselves killed, which felt thematically off, and I'm really big on theming, so we basically adjusted the rules so that victims can't be moved within a certain range of a monster, which I think fits pretty well. The monster has to go get the victim. The cards were a lot of work. Thankfully, there's a HorrorClix wiki, which lists every card and unit ever made for the game. So I basically went through, copied the whole list of cards. Some of them I just didn't like the theme didn't make sense, or it just wouldn't have been clear on its own in this new game for whatever reason, or the mechanics didn't quite work. So I took out a lot of them, I kept a lot of them, probably about 50-50. And then I came up with a lot more of my own, either just, horror movie tropes that the originals didn't touch on. The thing that was really time consuming was that obviously the original cards affected gameplay, and since HorrorClix and warstuff are two different games, affecting the rules in one game aren't gonna work the same in the other game because they work completely differently. So I basically had to reconceptualize how all the different cards would work. So taking damage works differently, so adjusting things like that, adjusting movement, because the original game was played on a mat with a grid, whereas warstuff, like a lot of tabletop games, is just free movement with a measuring tape, so I'd converted things like that. But overall, I think it came out pretty well. And then I took a look at warstuff itself and tweaked those rules a little bit. There's a lot of different special abilities that units can take, so I ended up tweaking them a little bit. I removed the morale phase from the game because I figure you're dealing with monsters, one of them getting scared and turning away doesn't make a ton of sense. So the powers that affected morale, I had to play around with those a little bit. I added one called Immobile, so it doesn't really make sense for a normal war game, but if you picture something like a possessed, like the evil tree from Poltergeist, it'll attack you, but it's not gonna move. So I wanted to be able to replicate that. And then probably the most time-consuming part was actually creating all the characters. Once I had come up with the list of all of them, I had to decide what powers I wanted them all to have. So I ended up making a giant spreadsheet of a list of all the powers and combinations of powers, and then just, putting the monsters in there so none of them would be duplicates. So I've got 13 sets of 35 monsters, and none of them have duplicate powers, which I am pretty happy with. And with the unit creation and the point values and stuff, it's so simple. If you disagree with a monster I made, make your own version, make whatever you want. That's the best part about it. But yeah, so that took a lot of time just figuring out what makes sense for this. Even in my mind, difficult terrain is usually water, so there's a rule called Strider, which ignores difficult terrain. So a lot of aquatic animals, I gave the Strider power. Thematically, it wouldn't really make sense if you have rubble or something else for difficult terrain, but if you squint, it's close enough. On a similar note, the Graboid from Tremors, I decided to give it the fly ability. Obviously, it doesn't fly, it's a tunneling worm, but fly ignores terrain, and if you're tunneling under the ground, you're going to ignore terrain, so it works out the same way. And then once I was done with that, it was time to actually put everything together in a nice presentation. I was gonna just use the warstuff PDF as is and just add in my own little changes, but I decided to just retype the whole thing, make my own border, make tokens for the game. I want it very much to be have everything you need you can print, except for monster figures, of course. But I'll do a video in the future about, different places you can get monsters. But if you're watching this, you probably already know or have a good amount. It wasn't easy, but there's not a lot to talk about because it was sort of just, sitting and plugging things in and thinking about it. But the final result, somewhat uncreatively, I decided to call Horror Stuff. And like the original, it is completely free to download, as are the tokens and the list of monsters. You can find links to all those below. The only other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is the different sets, because like I said, I'm just a sucker for thematic groups of things. I forget the proper titles I gave to all these sets, so I'm just gonna go by the shorter nickname I've been calling them. The first set is the classics. Obviously you have things like Frankenstein, Dracula, Mummy, Werewolf, all that. The circus set is probably the one that I brought over most directly from HorrorClix because I had a lot of the circus miniatures. So, there's things like the Ringmaster, a lot of like freak show vibes. As I mentioned near the beginning, cryptids are very near and dear to my heart, so of course there is a cryptid set. Things like, the Yeti, Mothman, Jersey Devil, all my favorites. And there was some wiggle room with these, like some of them could fit in multiple categories, but it was sort of not just what makes the most sense, but like this set has too many, this set has not enough, so we'll move some from here to here. They're all roughly distinct though. Fantasy, as opposed to things from real life mythology, is mostly inspired by like Dungeons and Dragons. So, things like owlbears, beholders, that sort of thing. Folklore, urban legends, and mythology are all three that were pretty similar, but in my mind, I kind of divided it by time. So mythology are the older things like ancient Greek, dragons, stuff like that. Folklore, I stuck more towards legends from like 1800s. So things like Spring-Heeled Jack, the Pied Piper, some lumberjack creatures that are really fun. And then urban legends, I tried to do more contemporary, like some of the creepypasta monsters like Slenderman, things like that. But they're all, human-created monster stories. Heroes are obviously the good guys. They save victims instead of killing them. There aren't nearly as many heroes in the game as monsters, just because I think the focus is more on monsters, but if you want to play heroes versus monsters, you can do that. And most of the heroes are in the hero set, and they are from a variety of things like movies and books, and even just, archetypal things like the sheriff. History is the real life monsters, so things like animals, the Beast of Gévaudan, the Tsavo man-eaters, like real dangerous animals, and also serial killers, so things like Charles Manson, Zodiac. That's the one like questionable set, but like it's for entertainment. I'm not condoning. Don't be a serial killer. Lovecraft is obviously all of his creations. He's made a lot of monsters and aliens, and they're all really cool, so they get a set of their own. The sci-fi set is also pretty heavily inspired by HorrorClix, just because of how many of the figures I had, but it's a mix of like movie characters and stuff as well. Probably the most exciting set, and the one that went through the most changes, is the movie monsters. There are so many cool movie monsters out there. It was hard narrowing it down. Some I ended up moving to other categories just so I could fit more in, but that's the great thing about it being a free game. I don't need to license any of this stuff, so I can use whatever I want. Mostly famous monsters. I did throw in like a few of my favorites that maybe weren't as well known, but again, you can make your own rules if I left anything out. Video games is monsters from horror games. You've got Resident Evil, Silent Hill, there's a lot of horror games out there, and it was hard narrowing it down, but I think I got a mix of my favorites and the most popular. In the future, I will definitely have more videos related to this. I actually wanted to release another terrain video this month to go along with it, but making a game takes a lot more time than I realized, so I did not have time for that, but that will definitely be coming soon, as well as, you know, other spooky terrain ideas in the future. Just off the top of my head though, you can use a lot of modern terrain. Obviously that's where most horror movies take place. You could do like lava, things like hell, abandoned asylums, you know, the sky's the limit. Horror can be whatever. I hope you enjoy the game. If you play it, please let me know. Although honestly, I mostly made it for myself, so I'm happy that it exists. But if you are into it, I hope you enjoy. The other thing that kept me a little busy from making terrain this month is that I did a really cool collaboration with Cajun Craftastrophe, an amazing channel you should be following if you're not. At the time of recording, I have not seen it, and it is not out yet, but I'm very excited, and if it is out when this is published, we will put a link below. But I think that's everything for this month. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you're not already. As always, be creative, be kind, and take care of yourself. And happy Halloween! And you would, you know, the movie tropes like someone tripping and falling, or probably would help if I remembered any of them. I wasn't really in any rush. Could I have my drink, please? This set has a few too many. This set has a few too few. Now, I also wanted to release a train video this month to go along with this.
Sounded like you said train. And it took me that
Choo
long
choo!
to figure out that you said terrain. So let's just...
As always, one day I'm gonna remember it right off the bat.